A pecuária brasileira tem sido acusada de contribuir com o aquecimento global pela emissão de metano. O Brasil é o maior exportador de carne do mundo. Como o senhor avalia a pressão para a redução da produção de carne e outros alimentos visando a redução da emissão de carbono?
Well, fundamentally, it's absolutely true that methane is one of the contributors to global warming. And we do need to cut our methane emissions just like we need to cut our carbon emissions. The right way to do this is, again, by innovation. There's a lot of people saying, oh, people should go vegetarian. Now, I'm actually a vegetarian, but I also know that it's very, very hard to get most people to be vegetarians. And to say to people, oh, you need to stop eating meat, is a little bit like saying you need to stop driving your car. It's not going to happen. So what we do need is much more innovation in low-emission cow technology, if you will, that we actually get cows, and they're working on getting that, that will genetically be modified to emit less less methane. And yes, of course, in the long run, it also seems likely that we will be able to make meat by totally artificial ways, that we'll simply grow them in vats, a little bit like we're also growing fish right now. The point, of course, is that there's technological solutions to some of these things, but we have to be realistic and ask ourselves, what is actually going to work, rather than just telling people, oh, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. You're not going to succeed by asking people to do less. What you are going to succeed is trying to make people do it smarter. And so, if anything, this again shows that technology will have to be the answer. It's very unlikely we can change human nature, but we can change technology.
Em comparação com os Estados Unidos e a União Europeia, como o senhor vê a posição do Brasil na discussão das mudanças climáticas?
I have to say, I do not know enough about the discussion in Brazil to know what your level of discussion here is. But certainly my impression is that there's a very progressive tendency both among Mexico, Brazil, and South Africa. And one of the points that I at least want to emphasize is, let's look at South Africa, which I know a little more about, is that it comes at a cost. South Africa has been trying to limit its carbon emissions quite dramatically, and what we're seeing is a lot of blackouts, that they cannot actually support their industry and their mining industry, the stuff that will make them richer. So if I have a message to Brazil, it would be to make sure that you don't get your good intentions so far ahead of yourselves that you forget that the likely outcome is that you want to make your people better off while improving technology. So again, if Brazil could be a positive force in stopping our conversation about, oh, we're going to cut carbon emissions by 20 or by 30 or by 40% in X number of years, but instead starting talking about how do we actually increase the technology, research and development into these technologies, that would help the world much, much more. So fundamentally, this is about not, again, showing our goodwill, but about doing real policy that will have an impact. So if Brazil would be one of the people, or one of the nations saying, we don't want to cut our carbon emissions first and foremost, we want to increase our research and development into green energy technology, because ultimately that is what's going to force the rest of the world to eventually switch to zero carbon energy. That's the way forward, and I hope certainly that this kind of discussion that we're having today will help us move forward on that account.
Don't you think the real point of global warming alarmists is to seize and control third world's natural resources through UN regulations? Is there a totalitarian state project behind their intentions?
I have a hard time believing that there's sort of a vast-scale conspiracy in this sort of regard. Let's remember that whenever there's a project, especially a project that involves hundreds of billions of subsidy money, a lot of people will latch on. And of course, some organizations definitely have as their purpose to increase the power of the UN of course, and likewise there's lots of people who would like to see some way of getting lots more money. We see that with GE, they're trying to get a lot of subsidy money. We see that in Germany and many other places, and clearly there's also some who would like to see, for instance, the might of China being stopped, and one of the ways to do that is by starting to talk about global warming and saying you can't increase your CO2 emissions, or if you do, we're going to tax you on your imports, which is what France just tried to do. And France obviously not being one of the leading free marketeers in the world, that would seem reasonable that those are parts of the argument. But let's be real. This is fundamentally, and certainly when I speak to most of the people arguing for global warming, they honestly and sincerely believe this is an important issue. I don't think they're playing around. I think they want just as much as everyone here to do good for the world. And the answer is, instead of talking about possibly illicit and implicit motives, let's just talk about the very stated and obvious motives. They want to do good, we want to do good. Let's talk about how do we do that most effectively. And the conclusion very clearly from both the science but also the economics and certainly the politics of this is that the current way of dealing with climate change spends a lot of money, does very little good, and very often doesn't even get implemented. Fundamentally, that approach has been losing for the last 18 years, and it seems to be losing in the indefinite future. Why don't we try something that's smarter, cheaper, and more effective? That, I think, is the answer to get through to most people and actually engage them on their good intentions. If you want to do well for the world, why on earth would you want to follow a failed strategy? Why wouldn't you want to do something that actually does work?
Duas perguntas em uma só. Quais são os interesses por trás das notícias alarmantes sobre mudanças climáticas e como o senhor avalia as últimas notícias sobre manipulação de dados pelo IPCC?
First of all, let's remember, most of the reason why we hear a lot of bad news is because bad news sells. And honestly, that's not because of the bad media people, it's because of us. We know from lots and lots of studies, if you give people a pile of bad news and a pile of good news and say, read what you want, people overwhelmingly read the bad news. So of course the media is serving us exactly that. So we are at fault for only hearing the bad news, and it's certainly not just on global warming. Most of the information that we hear is obviously exaggerated simply because that's what sells. But what we also have to remember is that this is not a conspiracy. We have to discount for that if we're actually going to make good judgments into the future and good policy judgments. So I would simply say there's no sinister background for this. It's simply a fact that it works both in terms of getting people's attention from media, and then of course also because most researchers that cry the loudest alarm, they will get the most attention and probably also the most money. There's nothing wrong in that. We do want to spend money where there are problems or potential problems, but it also means we will end up hearing a lot more bad news than good news, and much of the bad news that we hear will inevitably turn out to be wrong. But we want that research to be made. We have to remember to discount it when we then hear it in the news. Now, what do I make of the recent scandals that we've heard? I would take issue with the idea that it's been falsified, the data. There's certainly been problems with the data. And I think if anything, what we have seen from, and I'm sure Pat will touch on that in just a moment, but my takeaway from the problem that we've both seen with the email scandal from the University of East Anglia, and also the problems from the UN climate panel reports, like the idea that the Himalaya glaciers would be gone before 2035, is much more that there has been a want to try to scare the pants off of us. And that is understandable, because a lot of the people that I know argue for global warming feel like it's so important, and why are people not listening? So they ramp up the fear factor a little bit and then ramp it up a little more, and eventually you're standing around and screaming. It makes sense, and for a while it worked. It made people pay attention. But of course, because global warming is a 50 to 100 year problem, changing our energy structure in the world will take that long. You can't scare people for 50 or 100 years, and eventually it turns out to be counterproductive. You move from a place where everybody screams and everybody are over-worried to a place where everybody says, oh, it's all just made-up stuff, and people end up being under-worried. We've actually seen that very clearly in the opinion polls, that people are moving away, and rapidly away, from worrying about global warming. So in some ways, you could say the Al Gore film was very powerful because it ramped up the fear factor, it made everyone scared, made everyone listen, but ultimately, Al Gore is in the way of making a good policy decision because that fear has turned on itself and now nobody cares. That, I think, is much, much worse than the potential, I would say, rather smallish problems in the UN climate panel. Yes, they have not done as they should. Yes, there has been breaches of policy, and there's certainly been some problems. But fundamentally, the science is still fairly clear that if you put in more CO2, you're going to see more temperature rise. The problem is that we have scared ourselves silly, picked bad policies, and now we're seeing the payback for this. What we need to do is to bring this conversation back on track and say this is not about being for or against global warming. It's about picking the smart strategies rather than the dumb ones.
Don't you think that Brazil has more preservation works and Brazilian farmer who are preservating deserve to be paid about ambiental services? How can they be paid?
It's very clear that if you're a farmer in Brazil, you would love to be able to get paid for your services for the world. And now there's nothing wrong in that per se. We do want to find a way to make sure that it pays to do the environmentally right thing. The problem, I think, is very often that we end up having very large bureaucratic schemes to do fairly little good, and we end up with a lot of gaming of the system, if you will. What we have certainly seen with the European emission tradings and with the CDMs, the mechanisms by which we have actually reduced carbon emissions by putting in new technology predominantly in China, has turned out to lead to massive amounts of fraud. Both directly, simply making up stories, but also a lot of dodgy reporting on a lot of dodgy accounting that probably means that somewhere between a third and two-thirds of all the reductions that we have seen turned out not to be true. And so we have to be careful in order to try to maximize the individual farmer to take care of the environment, that we don't end up setting up a scheme that will mainly enrich a lot of investors, making up a lot of false schemes, and essentially costing the world a lot without doing something about the environment. So I don't know how to incentivize the individual farmer in Brazil rightly, and I would imagine there are many more people here who would be much more knowledgeable. I simply want to make sure that before we engage in such a scheme, that we recognize there's a good chance that this is going to cost a lot more, simply because we'll have a lot of scheming, a lot of gaming of the system, and a lot of corruption involved in such a scheme. So by all means, try to do it, but do it very, very carefully, and make sure that you don't actually just allow everyone to, again, make a lot of money on doing virtually no environmental good.
Não somente no âmbito das mudanças climáticas, os problemas ambientais nos mostraram que o modelo atual de desenvolvimento não deu certo socialmente e ambientalmente. O senhor realmente acredita que ações como aumento do uso do ar-condicionado com maior consumo de energia elétrica e construções mais seguras contra furacões, beneficiando sempre os mais ricos, são as soluções para os impactos causados pelo aquecimento global?
I'm very happy that we have this sort of very fundamental question, and let me try to take it in the spirit that was asked. First of all, the questioner asks, isn't it obvious that the world is on a path of unsustainability? This will not work. Certainly that's our impression. That's how we feel that the world, we're hurling towards a place that cannot end well. But it's not true, right? I mean, look around you. Wouldn't you rather be born today than 20 or 40 years ago? Well, sorry, you probably were born 20 or 40 years ago, but wouldn't you rather have been born into the world so that you would actually enjoy the benefits of today rather than even 20 or 40 years ago? And all our experiences, certainly all of our data points, point to a world where we will be better able to make sure that people live longer, that they're better educated, that they have more access to most basic health care and to education, to virtually everything that matters to human lives. So in every objective, measurable aspect, the world has been getting better, and it's likely to continue to get better. Certainly when we look at hurricane impacts and malaria impacts, let's just remember that by 2080, we expect malaria, for instance, to be functionally gone. Why? Because people will be rich enough to actually avoid malaria everywhere, even in sub-Saharan Africa. So let's remember that most of the indicators tell us this world will be a much, much better place. Now, this does not mean that there are no environmental problems. There definitely are. And this does not mean that global warming will not be a worse problem in 50 or 100 years. It will be. But my question to the questioner, and I don't know who that is twofold. First of all, if we really mean that we worry about people that are dying from heat deaths, why is it we want to help them very, very inefficiently rather than efficiently? If we really worry about people dying from malaria, why is it we want to help them very inefficiently rather than efficiently? So I'm simply stating the obvious. If you want to help people not die from heat deaths, it's about making their circumstances cooler. That you do technologically, either through air conditioning or you do it through making cooler cities, putting more water features, forest, greenery, or paint some of the city white. Yes, I do believe that if we care about heat deaths, that is the right way to go. But the second problem of the question, the implicit question, is why don't we cut carbon emissions right now? I understand that sentiment. A lot of people feel, we got to do something. But we have tried that approach for 18 years. And it's failed for 18 years. What I do not understand is, if you care about the future, if you care about global warming, why is it most people keep on saying, let's follow the same failed strategies that are way too expensive, that don't work, and that probably won't be implicated in policy? Why is it we keep following those? If you really care about global warming, you should be investing dramatically more in research and development. So fundamentally, I disagree with the question on those 3 points. The world has been getting better, and it likely will get better, but this does not mean there are no problems. Secondly, if you care about, for instance, heat deaths, you've got to tackle heat deaths and not just make the politically correct statement. And thirdly, if you actually care about global warming, you have to follow a strategy that will work, that's cheap, and will actually have a dramatic impact, namely investing in research and development, and not just one that makes us feel good, one that every politician can go up and pontificate about, but not actually do, namely the current strategy of promising carbon cuts, but not actually delivering.
Encerramos aqui as perguntas e respostas. As perguntas que foram enviadas com o nome, elas serão respondidas por escrito aos senhores. Uma salva de palmas, o nosso agradecimento ao senhor Bjorn Lomborg pela sua palestra. Thank you.